Good evening. Hi, my name is Aaron Bryant, and I'm actually curator for photography and visual culture at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And tonight I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Walter Evans. If you don't know who he is, which I'm sure you already do, you'll get a much broader appreciation of this gentleman after tonight. Dr. Walter Evans, a retired surgeon, and his wife Linda, they are considered two of the nation's leading collectors of African American art. Their collection spans more than 150 years and is considered one of the finest art collections in the country. Born in Savannah, Georgia in 1943, Dr. Evans developed his interest in art during his medical training when he noticed the absence of African Americans in our museums. In 1979, he made his first major purchase, a portfolio of serigraphs by Jacob Lawrence entitled The Legend of John Brown. This purchase would be the beginning of a collection that has expanded to more than 500 paintings, sculptures, photographs by both 19th and 20th century modernists as well as contemporary artists. Walter and Linda Evans have toured a selection of roughly 80 pieces from their collection in an exhibition that traveled from 1991 to 2007. The exhibit has toured to more than 45 museums and university galleries nationwide. The couple have also loaned selections from their collection to U.S. embassies and major museums around the world. Additionally, they have established the Walter O. Evans Foundation for Art and Literature to provide a vehicle for the collection to remain intact and for others to be inspired and educated by it for generations. Now, Dr. Evans attended Howard University. He also went to Meharry Medical College, and he graduated from the University of Michigan School of Medicine in Ann Arbor. And until his retirement in 2001, he was chief of general surgery at Hutsville Hospital in Detroit. After his retirement, though, he continued surgery, traveling to remote areas in South America to do pro bono work. Presently, Dr. Evans is on the board of visitors for the Savannah College of Art and Design, the Savannah Economic Development Authority, and the Savannah Chamber of Commerce. He is also a past board member of the Detroit Institute of the Arts, the Charles H. Wright Museum in Detroit, and the Margaret Walker Alexander Research Center. After he and his wife both retired, they relocated to Savannah, Georgia, where they remain committed to sharing African American art and America's cultural legacy through their collection. Now, before I ask the good doctor to come up to the stage, I have to do just a little bit of housekeeping here. If you can, please turn off all your electronic devices, tablets, cell phones. And I should also mention that this program is in support of the exhibition Harlem Heroes, Photographs by Carl Van Vechten, which is currently on view through March 19th. And if you haven't seen the exhibition, it's really an incredible exhibition and well presented. I've seen it twice already, and I'll be back tomorrow to see it again, actually. And then I also want to let you know that we have microphones you'll see on either side of the auditorium. So we're going to have a question and answer period afterwards, after Dr. Evans' talk. And we ask that you go to the microphones to ask your questions because tonight everything's being webcasted. So we want to make sure that the folks who are watching over the internet can hear your question. And so we have a treat tonight, Van Vechten and the Harlem Renaissance, a talk by Dr. Walter O. Evans.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron. And I want to thank Nona Martin for making this possible and for inviting me to this prestigious art institution again. I was here several years ago, and I enjoyed it very much and have been here many times in the past. And I absolutely love this institution and all of the artwork within. I also want to point out my wife here, Linda, and have classmates here from high school in Hartford. And anyway, thank you. Who was Carl Van Vechten? Who was this white man who could feel at home in Harlem, socializing with blacks, and at the same time entertain African Americans in his home for mixed-race parties at a time when this was virtually unheard of? To answer these questions, one must go back at least a generation prior to his birth, but let's briefly explore Van Vechten's migration to America. Tunis Van Vechten, a farmer, came to America from the Netherlands in 1638. He landed in New Amsterdam, now Manhattan, on August the 4th. He thrived as a brewery owner, and a grandson, Michael, was able to buy 900 acres in New Jersey in 1685. Nearly a century later, Derrick Van Vechten entertained the quartermaster for George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, during the Revolutionary War. After the war, a portion of the Van Vechten family moved west, and by the time Carl Van Vechten was born in 1880, the family name was fast becoming one of the most important names in the state of Iowa. Carl's parents, Charles and Ada, moved to Cedar Rapids they moved to Cedar Rapids where Charles' brother Giles owned a bank. The railroad, farming, meat packing firms, large grain processing, including Quaker Oats, had made Cedar Rapids into a boom town. Charles himself settled into a very lucrative insurance business. Carl was the third child of Charles and Ada. His sister Emma was 13, and his brother Ralph was nearly 18 at the time of his birth. His siblings were more like aunt and uncle rather than a brother and a sister, and doted on him. His uncle Giles would be a multimillionaire by today's standards. His parents, while not nearly as wealthy as Giles, were able to maintain an upper middle class standard and were able to hire 3 to 4 domestic servants. Among these domestic servants were 2 African Americans, a laundry maid and a gardener. Charles and Ada both had a long history of fairness in civil rights, and their children were instructed to address them as Mrs. Searcy and Mr. Oliphant, rather than by their first names. Their fellow Cedar Rapids citizens were aghast at this practice. For his 11th birthday, Charles gave Carl a copy of Cudjoe's Cave, a novel by abolitionist J.T. Trowbridge. This very book can be found in the Beinecke's collection at Yale University in the James Weldon Johnson Collected, founded by Charles, that we will discuss in a little. Charles went much further. In 1909, he and a young black preacher named Lawrence Clifton Jones founded a school for black children in Mississippi, the Piney Woods School, still in existence to this day. My wife and I visited this school a few years ago, just south of Jackson. Beginning in grade school and continuing throughout high school, Van Vechten had no interest in cowboys and Indian games played by his classmates. Instead, he read Shakespeare and Ibsen and listened to Mozart and Beethoven. Sometimes during his high school years, he saw a performance by Black Patty Troubadours, a traveling company consisting of dozens of black singers and dancers and acrobats, one of whom was the then unknown Bert Williams. And I'll tell you, this might be the only photo of Bert Williams that appears dignified. It took me a long time to find this photo of Bert Williams. Van Vechten enrolled in the University of Chicago in 1899. He had visited the city at least once before during the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 and had fallen in love with the city's cosmopolitan environment. During his college years, he not only attended performances of the Chicago Opera and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, but made rounds to an area called the Levee, Chicago's notoriously illicit nightlife district, with street after street of gambling dens, cabaret clubs, gin palaces, saloons, and more. Prostitutes walked the streets in the levee at will. Van Vechten claims to have been a pianist at the famous Everly Club, where the rich and famous frequented. People such as John Barrymore, Prince Henry of Prussia, Theodore Dreiser, Jack Johnson were regulars. With a classmate in tow, Van Vechten got to know several venues in the Black Belt on the south side of Chicago. Usually they were the only white faces in the club, such as the Dreamland Cafe or the Lincoln Gardens. This was an altogether different experience from the sanitized African-American entertainment he had experienced in Cedar Rapids. He even went so far as to invite one of the singers, Clarita Day, to perform at one of his fraternity's social functions. It was at his fraternity house that he befriended its housekeeper, Mrs. Desdemona Sublett. She was a devout Christian who invited him to a variety of activities in the Black Belt, including church services, weddings, etc., where he was the only white in attendance. After these experiences, he crowned himself an honorary Negro. Following graduation from college in 1903, Van Vechten went to work as a journalist at Chicago American, a newspaper owned by William Randolph Hearst. The paper was run on the principles of yellow journalism, and its object was to make news, not report it. One of his assignments was to supply photos to accompany the stories he wrote, and eventually he graduated to write the Society gossip column. When he insulted the wife of one of the senior editors in one of his columns, he was dismissed. He then made his way to New York City in 1906. This is Van Vechten at age 25 when he made his move to New York City. Soon after the move, he was hired by the New York Times as a staff writer and became its music critic in 1907. This job was less as a music critic and more of a celebrity watcher. Spending well beyond his means, he began to beautify himself with expensive clothing and jewelry. It was around this time that Van Vechten became more open with his sexual proclivities. He had known since childhood that he was attracted to other men, but it was not until his move to New York City that he was most open with these activities. Nonetheless, he entered into a short-term marriage with a friend from his childhood in Cedar Rapids, Anna Snyder. Before his divorce was final, 5 years later, he had his sights on a new lady, Fania Marinoff. Marinoff was a Jewish theater actress who had migrated to America from Odessa in the Ukraine as a young child with her parents. Marinoff knew of Van Vechten's sexual proclivities, but she needed the security that he would provide. Though rocky at times, due to Van Vechten's hard drinking and partying, they would remain married until his death in 1964. In 1916, Van Vechten signed a book deal with a new publishing company, Alfred Knopf. His book, Music and Bad Manners, was only the third book that the young firm had published. His subsequent relationship with Alfred and his brilliant wife, Blanche, would prove to be pivotal in his future promotion of African American writers. In the summer of 1924, one of the editors at Knopf passed Van Vechten a book, a novel entitled Fire in the Flint. The book was an impassioned protest against segregation and oppression in the South, written by African-American Walter White. White was the assistant secretary for the NAACP and would go on to lead the organization from 1931 until 1955. The two men met at Van Vechten's apartment and immediately hit it off. Van Vechten had never before knew an African American that he could relate to for more than physical performance. Walter White was a black man who used his brain rather than his body for creative expression, yet managed to maintain an authentic black identity in his writing. Van Vechten wanted to meet more African Americans like Walter White, and he could not have chosen a better guy than White. Although their relationship from the very first was warm, each valued the others in terms of what the other could do for himself. White recognized what Van Vechten's influence could bring to his career and to the African American cause. Van Vechten saw White as a fast track into the cultured circles of black society. White ushered Van Vechten into the center of Harlem. Over the ensuing months, he would be introduced to Atelia Walker, daughter of America's first female black self-made millionaire, and would attend Alelia's legendary parties at her property on Edgecombe and 136th Street. He would meet County Cullen, James Baldwin, I'm sorry, not James Baldwin, not at that time. He would meet County Cullen, James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. DuBois, and more. He devoured the latter's The Souls of Black Folks and the novels of Charles Chestnut. In his own words, he became violently interested in Negroes to the point of addiction. The work that affected him the most was James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man. Introduced by Walter White, he and Johnson became fast and firm friends. Van Vechten was astonished by Johnson's vast range of talents: gifted musician, accomplished writer, skilled diplomat, and shrewd politician, and one of the few black men admitted to the Florida bar. Van Vechten held Johnson to be one of the greatest living Americans. Schooling himself with black cultural history by day, at night he developed an obsession with Harlem's nightlife. Under White's guidance, Van Vechten became acquainted with black people of all backgrounds, from social workers to artists, to writers, to hard drinkers like himself. Although he had visited black nightclubs in the Tenderloin district of Manhattan from the time he first arrived in New York City, he had not strayed uptown much prior to his meeting White. Very quickly, Harlem became his all-consuming passion. There were some clubs in Harlem, such as the Cotton Club and the Plantation Club, that only allowed blacks in as performers or workers, not as patrons. Van Vechten stayed clear of these. Small's Paradise was a place to be seen among Harlem's black elite, but he was more excited by places of the lower class, where the lower classes hung out. The Nest was one of these places, described by Claude McKay as bright, crowded with drinking men, jammed around the bars, treating one another and telling the incidents of the day. Longshoremen in overalls with hooks, Pullman porters holding their bags, waiters, elevator boys, liquor-rich laughter, banana-ripe laughter. The Nest was an after-hours den in the basement of a brownstone on 134th Street. The Nest was where he first met Nora Holt, a gifted cabaret singer who would come to the Nest to unwind after long sets elsewhere. Holt was known for her extramarital affairs and had a penchant for stripping and dancing naked at parties. Van Vechten felt that Holt held in one body the ideal elements of black identity, thoughtful and urbane, as well as being physically and sexually expressive. The male writers that Van Vechten socialized with in Harlem included County Cullen, Eric Waldron, Alain Locke, Wallace Thurman, and Richard Bruce Nugent, all pivotal figures of the Renaissance and all gay. It should be noted that Langston Hughes was not on the scene in these early days of Van Vechten's Harlem explorations. At his home just south of Central Park at 150 West 55th Street, blacks were routinely invited as guests at his lavish parties. This practice was unheard of in white New York City at that time. Inside apartment 7D, white society mingled with struggling black artists who laughed, drank, and danced the Charleston together. George Gershwin was usually on the piano. Tales of what went on at Van Vechten's party became part of the lore of Manhattan in the 20s and 30s. But the one that was most repeated the most involved Bessie Smith. This is the account that Smith gave, and she was fond of telling. She performed in New York in December 1928. Smith was known for her heavy-duty drinking. Upon her arrival at one of Van Vechten's party, he came up to her and offered her a lovely, dry martini. Smith said, Smith was already drunk and told Van Vechten that she had never had a martini wet or dry and wanted nothing but straight-up whiskey. After downing a first, a second, then a third shot of whiskey, she launched into a set of blues standards, nothing short of mesmerizing. When it came time for her to leave, Marinoff went up to Smith and put her arms around her and attempted to give her a goodbye kiss. Smith flew Marinoff to the floor and said, "Get the blank off away from me. I ain't never heard of such blank." The Smith party might have generated the most gossip, but the most important party was one that Paul Robeson and his wife, Eslanda, attended on January 17, 1925. Robeson sang spirituals in front of some of the most influential people in New York City with Gershwin on the piano. Sometime during the spring of that year, the inaugural awards dinner for the monthly Opportunity magazine, the journal for the Urban League, was held. Receiving an award was virtually unknown 23-year-old Langston Hughes. Hughes recited his poem, The Weary Blues, during the ceremony. Van Vechten attended the performance and was captivated. At some point during the evening, Van Vechten asked Hughes if he could show Alfred Knopf some of his poems for possible publication. Hughes was then working as a busboy in D.C. at the Wardman Hotel. Brought several of his poems to Van Vechten's house the next day before heading back to D.C. on the train. In short order, Hughes had a publishing contract with Knopf, his first book publication, The Weary Blues. Thus began a lifelong association and friendship between these two men. Following the publication of Hughes's book, Van Vechten's work as a deal maker and publicist was one of the furnaces that fueled the Harlem Renaissance. He was able to raise the profile of many African-American artists and writers at home and abroad. In spite of this, some Harlemites were highly suspicious of his motives. For one thing, his novels, some very, very successful, always featured black as mute servants to decadent whites. Countee Cullen was one of the many doubters. Cullen was eager to socialize with Van Vechten, but never fully trusted him. He thought Van Vechten was only interested in sex, song, elevating his own profile among blacks and the downtown whites. When Van Vechten wrote an article about blacks in the Vanity Fair, Cullen stated that Van Vechten was, and this is a quote, "coning money out of niggers." If some blacks were irritated or angered by his self-appointed role as Harlem's one-man publicity machine, many whites found it absurd and teased him for it. Van Vechten paid little attention to this teasing. He saw himself doing vital work, creating a bridge between the racially divided worlds of New York City. And this is a caricature that Covarrubias made of Van Vechten, showing him as a black man. And it says a prediction from Covarrubias. White patronage of blacks was not unique to Van Vechten, nor unique to the day. The white-owned Survey Graphic produced what is still regarded as Harlem's Renaissance Bible. They soon thereafter published the Negro Anthology. The Spingarn Medal, given annually by the NAACP to the person who had done the most to promote the cause of African Americans that year, was a gift of the white Spingarn family. Charlotte Mason. Charlotte Mason was a fabulously wealthy woman with a mansion on Fifth Avenue who created around her a circle of black writers depending on her largesse. She had to approve all their writing projects, and they had to produce a stream of material. She required that they call her godmother. Chief among her stable of writers were Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, and Zora Neale Hurston. One day in August 1925, the day after Van Vechten's publication of his latest book, Firecrackers, he noted in his diary that he had come up with the name of his next book. It would be called Nigger Heaven. He did not dream up this term. It came from use in African American communities, referring sarcastically to the balconies in movie theaters that blacks were required to sit in certain communities. It also was used to refer to the sublime atmosphere and experiences in certain night spots. He did run the proposed title by a few of his trusted friends. Grace Nell Johnson, wife of James Weldon Johnson, warned him to expect a venomous response. Walter White thought it a great title. County Cullen was incensed. Van Vechten's father castigated him and urged him to please not use that title. His father died before publication. Well, the book was published in August 1926, and Grace Nell Johnson was correct in her prediction. Within Harlem, not too many were pleased at how blacks were presented. W.E.B. DuBois, never much of a fan of Van Vechten, excoriated the books. Most African American newspapers refused to advertise the book in its pages. Van Vechten's black housekeeper, Maida Fry, came in one morning with a pile of furious reviews from the black press. The reaction from the white community was mixed. D.H. Lawrence from across the Atlantic thought it second-rate. On the other hand, Sinclair Lewis, H.L. Mencken, F. Scott Fitzgerald praised it. Many whites said that it taught them quite a bit about blacks in America. Prior to the publication, W.C. Handy and Van Vechten had become rather close. Not long after the publication, a birthday party was being thrown for Handy at Small's Paradise, to which Van Vechten had been invited. Most of Van Vechten's white friends advised him not to go. However, he went anyway, accompanied by Zora Neale Hurston. To his relief, the evening went without incident. Towards the end of 1926, the Van Vechtens took a long vacation to get away from all the fray in New York City. A significant event happened to Van Vechten in June of 1928. Not long after his return to New York City, his brother Ralph, who was living in Chicago, died. Ralph's widow, Fanny, passed a short time later. After Van Vechten attended Fanny's funeral, he learned that he inherited 1/6 of his brother's multi-million-dollar estate. He and Marinoff were then instantly wealthy. One of the first things he did was take a prolonged sojourn to Europe. Not long after this European sojourn, his friend Miguel Covarrubias returned from Europe with a new Leica camera. After explaining how relatively easy it was to operate, Van Vechten found his new calling. In the early days of 1932, Van Vechten converted a room in his house into a dark room. His newfound hobby quickly became a full-time obsession. Before long, he was taking portraits of any and all who would sit for him, both black and white, including himself. These are some of the photographs that can be found in this exhibition here in the museum. These photographs were not for sale. They were for his own use, but he did gift most of his subjects with at least one of the prints. In February 1936, 1 year before her tragic death, Bessie Smith returned to the scene of her infamous outburst. It was the first time either of them was sober in the other's presence, this time on her best behavior. Van Vechten was proud to have captured her in a quite reflective mood. When Billie Holiday came for a shoot in 1949, it took Van Vechten 2 hours to break through her contrary and sullen exterior. It was not until he showed her photos of Bessie Smith, her great heroine, that she let her guard down. W.E.B. DuBois was a hard sell, but he agreed to put down past hostilities and submit to a sit for a Van Vechten photo, smiling warmly as he did so. In June 1938, James Weldon Johnson died in an auto train accident. Mrs. Johnson was in the automobile at the time but survived the incident. This was a tremendous loss to Van Vechten. Not only was James Weldon Johnson a great friend, but Van Vechten thought of him as an intellectual equal and a collaborator. Van Vechten formed a committee to erect a bronze sculpture by Richmond Barthé to stand at 110th Street and 7th Avenue at the northern border of Central Park in Harlem. When plans for this died, Van Vechten decided to donate his voluminous collection of material on African American to Yale University to be called the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection of Negro Art and Letters, founded by Carl Van Vechten. In 1949, Van Vechten convinced Georgia O'Keeffe to donate her collection of modern art to Fisk University to be housed in the Carl Van Vechten Gallery. Van Vechten died in his sleep on December 21st, 1964, with his wife Fania at his side. By that time, he had ascended to new heights of respectability for his long work of promoting African American art, literature, and culture. Now, these next 4 slides here, these next 4 images are people that I knew very well and was very much friends with, that Van Vechten took. I didn't know Van Vechten personally myself, but I knew all of these people well. Margaret Walker Alexander, as I knew her, Romare Bearden. Didn't know James Baldwin as well, but I knew him, and actually collected the largest collection of his letters, which are now in the Bynee collection and the James Weldon Johnson collection at Yale. That's the largest collection to date that we know of James Baldwin. And this is Jacob Lawrence, who a very close friend, and an elderly, not long before his death, of Carl Van Vechten. And that's going to conclude my talk, except for one thing I did want to show you. And this was, I guess you might call it almost serendipitous, because just 2 days ago, my friend at my acquaintance at the Beinecke collection sent this book to me that was just published, hot off the press. I don't even know if you can get it yet. And I wish I had received it a couple weeks ago, but it's from the collection, the James Weldon Johnson collection. It's called Gather Out of Stardust, our Harlem Renaissance album, Melissa Barton. And almost all of the images and material came out of the collection that Carl Van Vechten started. And I brought something else to share with you, if you care to come up to afterwards to the stage and view it. But these all photographed in our collection. We have about 3 times as many, mostly of the same person, James Weldon Johnson. But James Weldon Johnson and his wife, Grace, had a home in Maine. In fact, that's where the accident took place. It's about halfway between Brunswick and Bar Harbor, near the coast. And this is the house that they were living in. This photo was taken by James Weldon Johnson, by Carl Van Vechten. You can always tell an original Carl Van Vechten, but he signed every one of his photos in one of three different ways. He had an imprint. He sometimes signed them on the back, as he did on this photo of the house up in Maine. This is Grace, and another photo of Grace. And the third way he signed the back, usually in red pen. You know, Langston Hughes always signed his almost everything in green ink. Carl Van Vechten signed in red ink almost everything. And these are numerous photos, all signed by Carl Van Vechten or the imprint, and it usually put the date down there on every single one of them. You're free to look at these afterwards. These are all different images. He must have taken a voluminous amount of photos of James Weldon Johnson, because I know we have maybe 30. The other ones that I didn't bring are a large format, and I couldn't safely bring them. But these are all, this particular one was made into this one was made into a postcard. But I know you can't, but you can come up later. I'm sorry. You can come up later and view them. And was this the person that said she couldn't see? We do live together. But anyway, you can come up later and see that. I wanted to share that with you. Thank you very much for listening. I'll try to answer your questions.
How did you go about collecting the James Baldwin letters?
Dealers. At one time, African-American material, I had this pipeline. We not only collect art, we collect we have probably the largest Frederick Douglass collection, in private hands anyway. And many books are being written this year because, you know, next year will be his bicentenary of his birth, born in 1818, and so on and so forth. You know, books, manuscripts, there are over 100,000 books, first edition, mostly signed, in our home. But I got most of them from dealers, and over a period of time, many years. The Baldwin letter came in about 3 different tranches, one from his biographer, who's still alive. He just wanted to sell them, but I got them from the dealer. They're online now. The Yale has digitized them, so they're available online. There are over 100 of them. Well, thank you. Oh, there's another question? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, hi, sir. Mr. White was clearly, he was an African-American who clearly passed as white. And I was
Didn't pass. He could have passed.
Yeah, he could have.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, you know, how did he parade Mr. Van Vechten in the community?
People knew him.
Black? Oh, they knew
No,
him.
they knew he was black. I mean, he could have passed as white, as you stated, but he never did. The only time he passed as white was to go down south to investigate lynchings, but he never passed just to be passing.
Okay.
In fact, I got to tell you this: the book that that all the controversy was about, Nigger Heaven. Some people say it was based on Nella Larsen's, the person of Nella Larsen, in a way. And vaguely, you know, her mother was Danish, and her father may have been part Danish. Her parents were from the Danish West Indies. And she never passed herself, although she lived in Copenhagen for a while. She was born in the U.S., in Chicago, I believe. But she wrote 2 books about passing. One was Passing, and I think one was called There Is Confusion. I think that was her book, yeah.
Okay.
So, but she never passed herself either.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us and the presentation. It was lovely. My grandparents are from Jackson, Mississippi, and we used to visit Pineywood. And my grandfather was on the board, so that spoke real volumes to me.
Still in existence to this day.
It's still going strong.
From 1909.
It's a very special school. My question is, you probably also have collections on this, but I'm wondering if you have any collections on the kind of Black Renaissance life that was happening in Paris in the 1920s. And then a personal question, if you had the choice to live between the Harlem Renaissance in the 1930s, well, 1910 to the 1930s, or the Paris nightlife in the 1920s for Black people, which one would you choose? Thank you.
Oh, can I have them both? I mean, that's like asking me, would I prefer Sarah Vaughan or Ella Fitzgerald? And I'm, you know, I have the capacity for choosing both. No, I can't make that choice. But to be honest with you, I've read about, you know, the Black Renaissance, as you might have it in Paris, and I know the great things that they're doing. I want you to look online for an exhibition that just took place in Paris, came down 2 weeks ago, called The Color Line. It was at the Quai Branly Museum. There is nothing like that ever presented in the United States. There were 600 major artworks and objects, et cetera, in that exhibition. And it could not have been presented in the U.S., and it was just amazing. But look it up online, The Color Line, and it was about the African-American experience from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement.
Okay, thank you.
In your Frederick Douglass collection, what's your favorite, maybe most meaningful piece to you?
Oh my God, that would be so hard. Let's put it like this. There was a letter that, no, you know, when Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery from Baltimore to New York in, let's see, it was 1838. He was 20 years old. And then he he got married. He you know, his then girlfriend or fiancée brought him, she came up a couple days later. They got married. They changed their name. He was Frederick Bailey, and they went on up to Massachusetts. And he attended this church where he became a minister, and he went to Nantucket Island to speak, and that's where he met Garrison. And of course, Garrison took him on a speaking tour, and he became famous. It's sort of like Paul and Jesus. There was Jesus who may not have been known had it not been for the conversion, you know, of Paul. Saul, who became Paul. So, you know, he made him famous and on the speaking tour. But I'm going to get to this one thing at a time in a minute. But anyway, they fell out because they had different views on how blacks should be freed from slavery. Garrison wanted blacks freed by moral persuasion, and Douglass said by any means necessary. He never resorted to violence, but he did say for any means necessary. So they became almost enemies, and they almost never spoke again in life. Douglass then moved from Massachusetts to Rochester, and he, you know, founded the newspaper, the North Star, and so on and so forth. And Garrison died in 1876, 19 years before Douglass died, who died in 1895. Well, even though they had become enemies, Garrison's widow came to Douglass and asked him to give the eulogy. And I have that handwritten eulogy. Now, it's been printed up. It's in a booklet form. But I have I think it's about a 10-page handwritten eulogy. But, you know, I really can't say that's the most favorite, but that's the thing that stands out. It's very meaningful, yeah.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. I actually was wondering, some of these portraits that he did are so famous, but you said that he didn't sell them.
No.
But he gave a copy to the artist. Did they then have copies made, or how were they all disseminated? And then my other question was, because I wrote down some of these names of people that you mentioned, but, so I figure I'll look them up, but I thought I might ask if you want to expound on who they were, like Horace Pippin and County Cullen. I've never heard of them. Thank you.
Okay, well, I won't embarrass you. But these are two very, very well and renowned people. Pippin, probably you can rank him as one of the most renowned American artist, untrained American artist. He was in the World War I, and he was injured. His right arm was injured. And when he came back after the war to help make ends meet, he started painting. And, you know, he never had any training or anything. But his paintings were so inspirational. Many of them were about his war experiences, but others were about, you know, just everyday life, the black community. He became, you know who Barnes was, of course, you know, Alfred Barnes. Barnes collected his work. He lived, I think he was from Chester, Pennsylvania, which is where he lived. And he started getting large amounts of money for those days. I mean, you know, hundreds of dollars, you know, for his paintings. And his wife didn't believe that he could get this kind of money for his paintings. I mean, these were, you know, she, it's said that she was extremely upset. I've heard, you know, that she almost went berserk, you know, because she thought he might have been getting this money illegally. She knew he couldn't be getting. But his work today, when I started collecting art, let's put it like this. This is how, there was only one artist, one African-American artist, whose work was going for 6 figures. One, and it was Horace Pippin. No other artist at that time in the 70s was getting over $100,000 per one painting. And now he's among a dozen artists whose work goes into the millions. Now, County Cullen, County Cullen was an adopted son, a poet who lived in New York City. Now, you're talking about the Harlem Renaissance. All of these people who, you know, the major players of the Harlem Renaissance, I can't think of any other ones who were from New York City other than County Cullen. I can't think of any other ones. Now, they may have been, but I really don't know who they are. He was the adopted son of a minister of a very important church in New York City. Very, very brilliant. And unlike his poems are almost the opposite of Langston Hughes' work. I mean, he wrote in iambic pentameter or what have you, and whereas Langston Hughes was a poet of the people, more or less. Very strict in his, very well educated, extremely well educated. And he was just one of the major players. I can tell you a lot more, but the story could go on and on and on. Many books of poetry did he write. And if you want me to give you some, you know, some of the names, I can do it afterwards. Be happy to.
Dr. Evans, I wanted to, it's Nona back here, and I wanted to see if our curator here at the American Art Museum can answer the question about how the collection came to the museum.
Oh, that's right. Somebody did, that was somebody's question as to how they were, how the photos were disseminated as well, right? Well, let me say one thing before she says that. These, James Weldon Johnson was given a lot of his. They were very, very close. And you must remember, he died in 1938. He didn't really start taking photographs in a large way until 1930. So he must have taken a voluminous amount of photographs. But basically, most people just had the one photograph, and some, like James Weldon Johnson, may have had a lot more. But please, I'd like to know how these arrived at the museum here.
Hi, I'm John Jacob. I'm the photography curator at SAM. After Van Vechten had been photographing for a while, he also began placing his archival material of music, about cats, about art, and all sorts of different subjects in different settings, in different university settings, and the Beinecke is the most important of them. But he did this all across the country. There's in New York City, there's the Historical Society. Howard University has a collection, and he specifically put his photographic collections in many of these sites. And as he got older and he continued to make portraits, he continued to send those portraits to each of his different archives. So they really spread out. And also, I think that they're all, maybe not all, but most are in the public domain. Our group was, the first big chunk of our photography collection in 1983 was a transfer from the National Endowment for the Arts, and an organization called the Eakins Foundation Press put this together as a portfolio. And originally they had applied for funding to do 2 Van Vechten portfolios, one of men and one of African American men and one of women. And in the end, they only did one portfolio. What we have in the exhibition is the prototype that they developed for one of the portfolios, and in fact that one was never produced, so it's unique. And the other is what they submitted as their final report to the NEA, and it was unfinished at the time that they submitted it, so it's actually not the finished portfolio either. So both of those portfolios upstairs are unique objects.
Well, thank you. I didn't know most of this information. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for doing this event, and I'm a Howard alum, so HU. I just had a question about Jacob Lawrence. He's one of my favorite artists, so I just wanted to know a little more about your relationship with him and your interest in his work in your collection. Thank you.
Well, my first purchase of, I think you heard, my first purchase of African American fine art was a 22-piece portfolio, the John Brown series. And right after acquiring that, I looked, he was living in Seattle on Northeast 37th Street. He later moved downtown, but I found his, he was listed in the phone book. I got his address and wrote him a letter, asked could I come out to visit him, which I did. That was a couple of years after this first purchase. By that time, I'd had a few more of his works, major works. And I took my twin daughters, I think they were 9 years old at the time. I took them out to visit Jake, and we spent about 3 or 4 days together hanging out with his wife, Gwen. And I just kept acquiring a lot of his work, among other artists as well now, you know. But by the time it was over, when he died, I was actually with him. He died in Seattle in 2000. And he had just few years prior to that, 4 or 5 years prior to that, he'd asked me to be on the board of the Catalog Raisonné. And the Catalog Raisonné is a compilation of the artist's entire body of work and essays, et cetera, et cetera. And I was the treasurer. In fact, we couldn't find a publisher. He's the only African-American artist to have a Catalog Raisonné, and we couldn't find a publisher because they didn't think Catalog Raisonné by an African-American could sell. And he's just the dean of the 20th century African-American artists. But so we privately funded it, which in retrospect was a good thing because we were able to do quality assurance. We won the Getty Book of Award when it came out. The Raisonné came out the year that he died. We had completed it by then in 2000. And it won, that year, it won the Getty's Book Award for the best art book in the nation. And how we were able to do that is because we raised all the money. In fact, my wife Lynn and I raised most of the money in Detroit. A couple $1 million. So And by the time it was over, I think we have the largest collection of his work, including what your Phillips has here. Phillips and the MoMA are probably second to our collection in terms of the original works of Jacob Lawrence. So,
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. Thanks for your talk and your presentation this evening.
Thank you.